Hello, everybody. Hopefully, the technology is going to be working for us today. A few things haven't worked at the moment. Oh, I know why. Uh, anyway, hello. Today's class is going to be on container gardening, and I know we have a few watchers who are out of state, only because at least one person was wondering why we hadn't started yet, because Arizona has that Arizona time. Arizona's always got to be different. So for those of you who are out of state, Arizona doesn't observe daylight savings time. I don't know why, but I guess Arizonans don't like to be inconvenienced. I have no stance on that. Today's class is going to be on container growing. By the way, it looks like I'm stalling because I am. Just making sure everyone gets on time. Here's a container plant. This is Sansevieria safruticosa. Sansevieria is actually one of the few succulents that can do well inside. Inside's a really tough place for plants, so it's a cool plant. This pot is, if you could see it, is kind of shaped like a cactus. This is from, I think it's pronounced Two Kates, T-U, and then K-A-E-T-S, Studio, our friend Nathaniel. And anyway, container gardening is really big for us for a couple of reasons. The most obvious reason is we own a plant nursery. So everything that we grow at the nursery is in containers, right? It's not our preferred method of growing things. I'd love things to be in the ground instead of the container, but there's many, many reasons that you may want to be growing something in a container. So, and I know it's a very, very popular subject. In fact, this class had more people on about a half an hour before we waiting for the show to start, about a half an hour early. So talk about next week's class. So Katie says talk about next week's class. It's going to be right plant, right place, planning the landscape. And that class is for to help people figure out where to put what plants and why. There's a lot of considerations about where you should place plants, and that's going to be mostly talking about plants in the ground, of course, but it's a lot about design, but with an emphasis on really making sure the plants get their needs met. Because what do we always say? Plants are not furniture. Don't treat plants like furniture. They're living things. So let's get the class started. I'm going to do a little clickety-click over here. Just ignore the weird thing there for a second. And Katie also reminded me to let you know that it's a $15 donation for the class. We don't require it. If you don't have the money, don't worry about it. But if you go on the website under online classes, it tells you how to contribute. So, all right. So container gardening. This picture, by the way, is a Dorstinia. It's related to yams, but it's something that cactus freaks grow. And that's actually one of the reasons that people get into container gardening. That a lot of people want to grow really cool plants, and sometimes those plants are best maintained in a controlled environment, and that's one of the reasons you might be growing stuff in a container. Quick overview of what we're going to be going through in this class. We're going to go over the basics: watering, feeding, transplanting. We're going to talk about a little bit about soils. We're going to talk about container gardening throughout the various seasons. We're going to talk about various types of container growing, raising edible crops a little bit, and growing cacti, succulents, and houseplants. And then we'll have a Q&A. And I suspect that our Q&A is going to be a little bit more, little bit longer than normal because people have a lot of questions about this subject. So anyway, let's start. You might wonder, so you're all here for different reasons. I know when this subject comes up, there's different people um, considering different reasons to grow in a container. Some of you have no other option. You may not have a lot of yard and space to grow things. Some of you are using raised beds because it's more convenient. Maybe you have a bad back, and it's nicer to have that like raised bed to manage your garden plants. You might be like my friend here. That's Mark Demmett, and he grows orchids, which of course need to be grown in containers. He grows a lot of things. Sometimes it's just a design thing that you have in mind, and you want to grow some plants in containers for that reason. Some of you just want to have plants everywhere. So, hold on a second, I'm just checking in here. Internet's being a little wonky, so I hope you're getting all this. And all the questions you might have, you can either use the live chat service in YouTube, or if you don't see that or don't know how to use that, you can see on the bottom of the screen there's a phone number you can text questions to, and Katie will make sure that all the questions are managed while I'm blabbing. Yeah, you might just want to have plants everywhere. So, and some of you are just into weird plants, and you know a lot of these types of plants are much better maintained in a container, as I alluded to already before. Especially if you're into growing like certain succulents and caudiciforms and stuff like that. Or maybe you're just a plant hoarder and you ran out of space. You probably have like 5 acres and you're still growing stuff in containers because you're like us. You're just kind of a hoarder. That is our problem. So yeah, we grow a lot of plants in containers, not only because we have the nursery, but because we also are addicted. And so we have no space in our yard and left to plant things in the ground. There's a few spots that we can maybe make some room, but maybe. But it's like we have things in containers because there's just literally no places left to put anything. So you might be that person, and trust me, I understand. By the way, you know this. You're taking a class at home. Have a beer. Have a drink. We're drinking the Cactus Wren by Westbound.
I don't know if anyone can see this.
Oh yeah, they'll see it. This is lagged a little bit. Westbound is just down the street from us, and they deliver. So they do cocktails, either delivery or pickup. So that's a new thing. Thank you, COVID-19, for
and frozen cocktails. Heyo.
That's right. They have those little. There's like what do you call those slush? Those frozen.
It's like a Otter Pop for adults.
Yeah, they have Otter Pops for adults. So that's kind of nice. So we're drinking the Cactus Wren, which is Whiskey Del Bach, a little bit of rum, Pueblo, Capoletti, and pineapple juice and lime. So it's kind of nice. Anyway, on to the subject. Let's talk about watering. So right now, most of you are in Arizona. Although some of you might not be, but most of you are in Arizona. And it's hot, right? Like, understatement, but it's really hot outside. And if you're watering plants in containers, you have to water most things every day, unless you're talking about cacti and succulents. But you are watering cacti and succulents more often right now than normal because it's hot. Unless the plant's dormant, and we're going to get into that. But it's hot out, and that's the biggest mistake that people make when they're growing plants in containers is managing the watering, because pots dry out a lot quicker in a pot than they do in the ground, and it makes sense. It's exposed to the air, right? And also you got like depending on the size of the pot, you just got a limited amount of space that's up above the ground, a little more exposed to heat. The sun hits the side of the container, so that brings more heat that helps evaporate the water a lot quicker. It's not a very hospitable environment for a lot of things. Plants, the microbes in the soil, everything's a little bit more cranky than if they were in the ground. By the way, if you're waiting to,
Too cranky.
Am I more cranky?
I am.
Oh, you pointed to me.
I know, I'm not in the video.
I'm more cranky too, but yeah, it's a tough environment. Now, I wanted to say something really quick here. If you have some plants that you intend to put on the ground and you're waiting till fall because you think that's a better time to plant something, please, right after this video, go outside and plant that plant right now, because plants don't want to be in containers. They really would prefer to be in the ground. So let's just start off with that, okay? Now, I'm not trying to dissuade you from growing plants in containers. I just want you to, we got some slurriness here. I just want to make sure people get this. So, the internet's being wonky. There's a storm in back.
Blowing.
They're getting the rain. We get all the wind. Plant some more trees, please. Let's everyone plant trees right now so that we get some more rain and not just the wind. All right. So anyway, if you have a plant in a pot and you're waiting to plant until fall, plant it now and keep it well watered. But it's a lot more work to keep it alive in a container than it is. God, it keeps.
Try to restart that.
There's no. Get off that, though. That doesn't help. It puts strain on the thing. Okay. We got a little distracted here because we see that there's some wonkiness with the internet right now. So I'm just going to look at a few things here. Okay. All right. So let's just keep going, and if you guys, if there's a lot of cutoff and you don't know what I'm saying, will you please comment some in one of the ways so that we know that you're getting all this information, and just ask questions, please. So anyway, growing plants in containers is challenging. It is not impossible, but it's a little more management than it is in the ground. Okay, and the point that I was making about if you're waiting to plant something in the ground and you're waiting because you think fall is a better time to plant, that's not true. Get that plant out of that container in the ground. They really want to be in the ground. Okay. Anyway, so the watering is going to change throughout the year, right? You're watering every day now, probably, if you're watering more mesic plants, meaning wetter growing, or even a lot of desert plants. Cacti and succulents, you're probably watering about once a week. Some succulents maybe twice a week, something like that. And there's a lot of play with that, like how much, how big the container is, or what the soil's like if it's super well drained. So that'll all play into it. But pay attention throughout the season. When the fall comes and it finally starts to cool off, you'll have these wonderful times when you can go a week without watering. It's kind of amazing. Like, it'll happen at the nursery, and it makes us so spoiled because right now we water every single day. So and if we don't, our plants would die. So yeah, it's a nicer thing when that season changes. You need to watch your plants, and you can tell when they don't want to be watered as much. The soil will still be wet. Pick up the container if you're not sure. Sometimes the top of the soil won't tell you the truth, but the weight of the plant will tell you if it's wet or dry. You can get those moisture meters. I've never used one, so I don't have a lot to say about moisture meters. I prefer using my eyes and using in-person ways of gathering evidence, but moisture meters are probably not a bad idea. I just don't know how accurate they are, but lifting a pot will tell you. There's various methods of watering that people come up with, and some of these methods are a little kitschy, and maybe a little bit gimmicky. Sometimes people are just trying to sell you something. I don't use anything except regular old-fashioned watering. So there's 3 pictures in here. The first one is that little clay thing with the water thing, and the idea is that it slowly waters those plants. The top right there, you see a pot that's sitting in a tray, and so you're watering from the bottom up. That also grows mosquitoes in this climate, if you're growing outside or inside. And then the bottom right there is a plant in a jar that has no drainage, and they put gravel on the bottom. And some plants would just die in that environment. I don't really like, using gimmicky things. I just believe in watering thoroughly. And there's a reason for that. When you water from the top to the bottom, you're pushing those salts through. And you can actually see on the bottom of that pot there, that white, that's salt. That's salt buildups. And that's a problem with using some of these other gimmicks, is that they don't consider how salty our water is. So this beautiful drawing is by yours truly, but it's just a basic thing. It's the same rule as. Are you laughing at my art?
Yeah, it's beautiful.
This is just to illustrate the same thing as if you're planting in the ground. If you transplant a plant into a pot, you want it to be level with the soil level. You never want to bury a plant. Well, not never, but almost never you want to bury a plant deeper than it was in its previous container. And that's because it'll smother the plant and rot the base of the plant. Many problems develop. Most plants don't tolerate being buried deeper than they previously were. The one exception I can think of at the moment is a tomato plant. You pull off the bottom couple leaves and plant it a little deeper, it will re-root. So you could do that with tomatoes, but in general, if you don't know, don't bury it any deeper. And obviously, by this gorgeous drawing, you can also tell that I've left a lip, meaning that when you pot a plant up, make sure you leave a lip so that when you water the plant, that you have enough space for the water to collect and then push through the whole soil profile. So that's just a quick illustration. Watering, this is a little automatic little system here. And these don't always work very well because the way that they deliver water is meant for the ground, and sometimes, especially in potting soil that tends to be a little looser, that water just falls right down to the bottom, and so the sides of the pot can really dry out. I don't really like this method of watering, even though it would save me a lot of time. We do have some of our pots at the nursery here, the growing area, on automatic irrigation, but I still have to go and hit it a little bit more afterwards to make sure the sides are hit, so it doesn't really save me that much time, just a little bit. But the best way to water is just really with the good old-fashioned watering can or with a hose. So feeding in containers, this is something that people often neglect. If you're wondering why your plant's just sitting there not doing anything, it may be because you're not feeding it, or maybe you're feeding it the wrong thing and you're burning the plant. But here's a few things to consider and think about. Again, container situations are very different than other situations when it comes to everything, watering, feeding, and everything. So, but nutrients leach out of a container much faster because think of it as like a tunnel, right? You got this little tunnel and you're just pushing that water through every day. It's a little different than in the ground where the water's dispersing out more and there's some pushback from beneath. There's a natural, ebb and flow of the water in in a soil profile that's the ground, but in a container it's like a one direction thing. So you lose nutrients a lot quicker. Microbiology is a little more difficult to maintain, and what do I mean by that? If you've been following our classes regularly, or you've been gardening for a while, and you understand how plants get their nutrition, they require um, a live soil, and soil is live soil has microbes in it, and the microbes consume organic material and turn it into food for plants. It's really tough in a container um, to do that because microbes don't like the hot. It's hotter. Um, the gas exchange rates within a container is a little different than in the ground. There's a lot of things that make it a little more difficult. And it's not that microbiology doesn't exist in a container, it's just harder. We have an organic plant nursery, so we don't use synthetic fertilizers. We do organics, but we have to do a few things to keep those microbes happy, and it means watering a little more often and feeding and inoculating. So yeah, there's some things you can do, and we'll get into that. Delivery of food has some issues, and we'll talk about that too. I have an illustration, a picture of a plant that kind of shows you some of the challenges you have in adding fertilizer to a plant that's in a pot. Some fertilizers can be smelly, like fish emulsion. I think that's a silly thing to worry about, but you have someone coming over for the evening and you just fed with fish emulsion, and it does smell like the ocean for a day or two. And you may not want to feed fish emulsion to your plants inside the house.
Someone says the slides are fuzzy.
The slides are fuzzy. Yeah, I think that's just the internet. Sorry about that. We're trying on here. It looks okay, but yeah.
We can probably post some of the slides later.
Yeah, we can post slides later. If you don't know what the slide is, just let us know. So yeah, someone says that they still can't. Yeah, you don't need to read as long as you listen. I'm basically going to say anything that's written down, so if you can't read it, don't worry about it. Another thing, the bigger the container, the better. And that's just generally true. The more you mimic the ground, the better, because like I said, what makes container growing so difficult is how exposed everything is in a small container. Okay, so in this picture I have two types of fertilizer, and I'm not really trying to push any brands here at all, but I just want you to think about two ways here. One, that Eleanor's VF11 is a micro. It's called microfeeding when you feed with it's actually a synthetic fertilizer, but it's so light that it's a little friendlier to microbes. It's more like how nutrients are available in nature. And this is what we use in the house on our house plants. And you feed every time you water. You put a little bloop in your water every time you feed, every time you water, and give a consistent feed to your plants. The other side there is a liquid or a water-soluble fertilizer, and it's organic. And that's the other way to go. And that's what we do in the nursery outside, and that's what we do with all our outside plants. So basically, any of these things you add to your water and you water. In our nursery, we have an injector that injects our organic fertilizers into our hose. So when we water with the hose, we're watering with a little bit of food. But the way you would do it is just, however you normally water your plants, you add, the fertilizer in and whatever. But you should know, if you don't already, that our prejudice is to be organic. We don't want to support companies that use synthetic. Most of the companies that make synthetic fertilizers also make terrible pesticides, and we're just very anti all that. So we don't use synthetic fertilizers, and they're also not good for, if you're organic growing. The point of organic methods of growing is that you're encouraging the microbes to thrive in your soil profile. It's a little harder in a container, but it's not impossible. It just means a little more work. So that's what we do. And if you feed with the synthetic fertilizers have an unnatural high amount of salts in them, and that dehydrates and kills microorganisms. So we stay away from that kind of stuff when we feed with organics. And or in the case of this VF11, we only use this in the house, but that's like so watered down that it's almost like organic. So I hope that clears that up. Then of course there are some non-water soluble things that you can put into a container and scratch into the surface of the soil, and this can work. And this actually can help the microbes be a little happier too. These are not always usable in a situation, as you know, some of you probably already. Sometimes you just got a plant that you just can't. There's no room in the top of the container to scratch anything into. So these might be impossible. So, probably water solubles are the best way to go. But if you have some room in a pot, or if you're growing in a large raised bed, there's some soil profile or soil surface to work with. You can scratch in some of these. These are not liquids. These are, this is actual organic material that you scratch into the surface of your soil. Powders, yes. Yeah. So, and then these, the other thing you can add in, and again, like it doesn't matter if everything's blurry and you don't know what you're looking at. It doesn't matter. Just listen to what I'm saying, because the brands don't matter. It just matters that you know what I'm talking about. So these three things are just different microbe inoculants. So you'll see sometimes like there's EM is called effective microorganisms, and it's a microbial inoculant. The other two are just more aerobic microbe inoculants, but these are sort of like little microbes that you can add to the soil, like a compost tea. It's kind of like a compost tea. And by the way, you can add compost tea to container situations as well. It's actually a good thing to do. And if you do that, if you are already in the habit of making compost tea, and we talked about that 2 weeks ago.
Yeah,
2 weeks ago we talked about that. You can go look on our archives if you want to see about that. But so there are ways to inoculate your containers with microbes.
Somebody wonders, would compost be enough to add to plants and pots, or should they add a liquid nutrient or powders as well? They use bokashi compost.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So it all depends on your situation. If you can add in things that are stuff like that without burying your plant any deeper, then yeah, go ahead and add that in there. Or if you're talking about a raised bed, yeah, adding that stuff in is a great idea.
Compost.
Compost is a fine thing to add in if you can, and scratch it into the top.
Especially if you make it yourself. Compost you make yourself is 10 times better than anything you can buy. And there's reasons for that. And commercial compost is That was jelly.
That's jelly. Commercial compost is made to last on a shelf. It's not always made to be the best compost. But I do suggest, if you can, adding organic fertilizers is great. Now, if I don't like buying stuff. I think whenever you can make something that's better. But sometimes you just, you have to succumb. Here's a good reason why you might have to succumb. Here's a really cool plant. Can you imagine trying to add in some compost in that baby? Well, first of all, I wouldn't need any because it's a geophyte. But if you wanted to feed this plant, you can see some limitations there, right? There's very little soil access to this plant. You would definitely use a water soluble. However you water this thing, which obviously you're watering this thing from the top, and it kind of oozes around the sides, and that's how it gets in there. This plant doesn't need to be watered that often, but it's but this is a good example. There's a lot of plants like this, especially if you're growing cacti and succulents and caudiciforms. There's plants that are hard to add organic material, and you don't want to make the pot too much bigger on these guys because they don't want a lot of root room. And we'll get into that. I do discuss why on plants like this, but there's a good reason why you would want to use a water soluble fertilizer. So plant placement considerations for containers, because there are more considerations than in the ground. Obviously sun, right? So how much sun a plant needs is going to obviously determine where you put it. But also because it's in a container, it's a little more exposed. So there's a lot of plants that require a certain amount of sun. Maybe in a container, a little bit of a break is nice. And the best way to get that break is not to necessarily give it more shade, but to screen off some of that sunning. What I mean by that is there's a difference between getting shade and getting filtered light, right? So like at plant nurseries, because we're growing plants in pots, we don't want plants to become unaccustomed to the sun because they're going to go home and go into the ground somewhere. So we have a 30 or 40% shade cloth over our plants. And that keeps them such that they still are tough enough to go out in the full sun when they go into the ground. But while they're in a container, they'll get some sun, but they get that just a little bit of a break. So it's a screening, right? They're still getting the sun, but it's like having sunscreen on. A little bit of screening is a great thing for plants in containers, even plants that belong in full sun. Obviously, convenience is an important reason why you have plants in containers in the first place. You want to think about wildlife, both pro and anti. Well, we never really are anti-wildlife, but you don't necessarily want to take your, very rare succulent and have it in a place where a rabbit can just devour it. So that's a consideration of why you place something where you place it. Drainage is an important thing, obviously, too. And sometimes if you have a plant set on the ground where it blocks the holes that where the drainage happens, then you get some anaerobic activity, meaning lack of oxygen. The water's not draining very well. That happens sometimes. So if you have a pot that doesn't drain for some reason, there's holes in the bottom, sometimes where it's placed is clogging that hole up. And also, how permanent is that spot going to be? Because there's holes in the bottom of your pot, right? There should be, because you need drainage in a pot. Those roots will eventually grow through that hole and into the ground. You might not mind that. If it's a plant you don't need to move for the winter, if it's frost is coming, if it's not frost tender and you don't need to move it, it can stay in the same spot forever. You can root into the ground, and that's actually an okay thing. But if you don't want a plant to be stuck in a place, you might want to put it on something. And at our nursery, we have pallets where all our pots go on top of the pallets. And the reason for that is to keep them from rooting into the ground. I don't know if you've ever been to a nursery and you're like, oh, this plant looks really good. And you go to pick it up and it's like stuck to the ground. And you're like, nah, I'm going to skip that one. Because if you pull it off, you're going to damage the roots and the plant will wilt and some plants will die. So you want to place a plant on something so it doesn't root into the ground. Unless, again, you don't mind it's a permanent spot, then it's probably okay. So like here, I just have this as an illustration. Here's someone who grows, cacti. They got this nice little setup, and this is great. They may want to screen this off in the summertime when that sun comes, because this would be a really hot spot during the summertime. But they've got their plants up on something where they don't root into the ground. Of course, there's concrete there anyway, but they also have it tiered so that none of those plants are shading the other one out. So they're all getting even light. So this is a nice setup. I would in Arizona at least, or in Tucson, I would worry about it getting too much sun. But I just grabbed this off the internet. I don't know if this is an eastern exposure. If it is, then it's fine. Cacti really seem to do well under a mesquite, like on the edge of mesquite where there's like still light coming through, but it's filtered. Like cacti do really well in that situation. They like some filtering. I would probably do, a 40% shade cloth over. It would be good for almost any cactus. Um, so if you just use a shade cloth that's 40%, that's 30 or 40%. That'll be good for most cacti. And yeah, so again, in the ground there you don't need that shading, but in the ground their roots are also growing out a lot farther than they are in those little tiny pots. Here's that problem, there's that problem where the plant is rooted into the ground, and then when you pull it up and you want to move it, and you do this much root disturbance, it can kill a plant, or it'll at least make it look really crappy for a while. It'll wilt. So this is what happens when a plant sits on the ground for a long time. So that's why you put something underneath it. And like I said, the bigger the better. And get creative about pots. You might, if you have one good idea that I'll give you, if you want a nice, are you watching the phone too, by the way?
Yep.
Okay. If you want a nice raised bed and you don't want to have to build something, go to the feed store and get one of those, what do they call those?
Stock tank.
Stock tanks. Stock tanks come in many sizes. You can drill some holes in the bottom and fill it up with potting soil, which we're going to get into the kind of soils you use for raised situations or with containers. But the point is that there's many methods of creating containers. But again, the bigger the better. There.
Shade cloth for cactus only necessary in the summer.
Okay, so if you do a 30 or 40% shade over cacti, you can leave that year round. You don't have to move it. The winter sun's way less intense, but the other side of that is 90% of cacti are not even actively growing in the winter. So that's something to always think about too, and we're going to talk about that too. That when a plant is growing is also determining how much you water it. But yeah, the shade cloth can stay year round. It can stay under that situation. If you go to some of the Tucson is full of these wonderful cactus nurseries, by the way. And just because we own a nursery doesn't mean we don't want you to go to the other ones. We actually want you to go to them because we want you to love plants. And if you live in Tucson, you happen to live in one of the horticultural capitals of the world. There are so many plant freaks here, and particularly for cacti and succulents. And so there's nurseries that are world famous, but no one in Tucson knows them. And I'll give a shout out to Arid Land Greenhouses, for example.
Check it out.
Check them out. They are known all over the world, but and I think most of their sales are online, and no one in Tucson knows who they are. So Google Arid Land Greenhouses, and hopefully you'll still come back to our nursery because they have cool plants. It's all succulents, caudiciforms, cacti, but really cool plants, and we go there. But there's a lot of cool cactus nurseries here. I'm off track. Anyway, the bigger.
Oh, we were talking about the. Oh, audio's out.
Oh. Okay, I think we're okay right now. Looks like the audio went out for a second, but let me know if it's not. Okay, so there are a group of plants that lend themselves naturally to container growing. And we were just talking about Arid Land Greenhouses. They grow a lot of these plants. You don't have to know these words, but I'm gonna go through them real quick with you, just so you know that you have to always go back to where these plants grow in nature, and that'll tell you a lot about what they need. All right, it looks like most people are saying it's good. Okay, so
what about top dressing with cactus?
Oh yeah, so someone asked about top dressings, and top dressings are great. You don't want to bury a plant any deeper than it was in the container, for cacti and succulents, actually, I do use rock or granite or gravel. With other plants, I like to use wood chips. And I use wood chips on cacti too. They don't mind it. Wood chips are a little nicer. They don't reflect as much heat back up. And that cactus actually don't mind that. I mean, they like a little break too sometimes. So you don't have to beat a cactus up to make it happy. But they don't mind the rocks as much. With leafier plants, we tend to favor the wood chips. But again, the same rules apply. You still don't want to bury that plant deeper than it was in the container. In general, as you get more and more involved in certain types of plants, you can break that rule, but you should know if it's okay to break that rule. All right, a lithophyte. A lithophyte is a plant that grows straight out of rocks. There's no dirt. They just grow on or out of a rock. An epiphyte is a plant that grows on the surface of things, mostly plants, but sometimes rocks. They don't really root down into cracks or anything like that. A chasmophyte is a plant that grows in rock fissures. Rock fissures will sometimes have some soil in them. You see a lot of chasmophytes in Arizona. I mean, if you're hiking in the foothills, like if you've ever seen, the coral bean, Erythrina flabelliformis, sometimes they're just grown out of pure. It looks like they're grown out of pure rock, but there's actually soil in between the cracks. A lot of native ferns in Arizona grow that way too. A geophyte is a plant that has an underground food storage organ, like a bulb or like a caudex, or a thickened rhizome. And geophytes do well in containers. A lot of your caudiciforms are geophytes. Succulents, so plants that store water in their tissue. All cacti are succulents, but not all succulents are cacti. You know that, right? But they store water in their tissues, and the soil isn't as important to them as is their need to be in well-drained soil. So they tend to do pretty well in containers if you're treating them right. And then monocots, which monocots are everything from grasses to agaves. But monocots are just a group of plants that have particular traits. It's an evolutionary group of plants, and they're all related. Their roots don't swell, meaning that when the root comes out of the plant, that's always going to be the width that it is. It doesn't expand like a mesquite root does, right? If you plant a mesquite right next to your house and it gets into your water pipes, that mesquite a little tiny microscopic thread will get into the pipe and then grow and expand and clog your pipes up. Monocots don't do that. So you could actually grow, timber bamboo, which is a giant bamboo that lives up to its name, timber bamboo. It actually will never get into your pipes because they don't do that thing where they start off as a microscopic thread and expand. That's the problem. That's the trait that causes problems with your foundation or your pipes. And those are dicots. Monocots don't do that, so you never have to worry about your agave doing that. You never have to worry about timber bamboo doing that. They're not going to buckle up your plumbing. So. But also monocots tend to do well in containers. Here's a picture of a creosote bush. Creosote bushes are a challenge in a container, and we know this because we sell them, and growing them is very difficult. And why is that? This illustration is just another beautiful drawing, but the point here is that in a lot of desert plants in particular, especially shrubby plants that are not cacti, although a lot of cacti do this too, but they're succulents, so they have some storage. But leafy plants that are growing in the desert, when a seed hits the ground, that the first thing that the plant does is span its roots out as far as possible. And this is why a tiny, tiny little creosote bush that's only this big can live off of rainfall. And you go and buy a 5-gallon creosote bush and you go plant it, you can't let that live off of rainfall yet, right? Because you got to get it established. Why is that? Well, it's because that the plant needs to send its roots out. That's its method of dealing with drought, by sending its roots out as far and wide as possible, and maybe getting those roots under some surfaces where moisture is a little more prevalent. So so this is like a normal plant, and a lot of plants are like this, and this is why a lot of plants don't really love containers. Desert plants that use this method and are not succulent are difficult to grow in containers for this reason. And there's this fine line, especially with the creosote bushes. It's a xerophytic plant, meaning dry growing, but it also one of the reasons it's dry growing is it sends its roots out wide, and so there's this fine line between overwatering and underwatering in a container, and that's why they're difficult. Don't feel bad if you've tried to grow a creosote bush and you didn't do very well with it in a container. It's hard. This is also why you can't just dig up a creosote bush and put it in your yard. People tell me they're going to do that all the time, and they usually die because this is why. The roots go out so far. So if you dig this thing up and you're trying to get a root ball, you're going to probably kill it. So this is true about most shrubby plants. Like, try not to dig plants out of the desert anyway. But here's some chasmophytes. So plants that grow out of like rock crevices, and these all do really well in containers. Obviously, cacti. They're also succulent. That's a mammillaria down the bottom there. That red flowered thing is an erythrina, and I talked about that just a few minutes ago. But you see them all over the mountains in the foothills. They grow out of these rock crevices. By the way, that same plant with those little red flowers, that's a 60-foot tree in Sonora. This used to be tropical here, and as the tropics receded, some plants didn't stay, obviously. It got too cold for them. But some plants found a niche, and erythrina is one of those plants. It still freezes back all the time, but they actually are pretty big trees in those rock crevices. They're growing down in those crevices, and they find a little, it's a little microclimate where they can, the tops get frozen back, but they keep growing back, and anyway, they grow really well in tight containers, so you can grow erythrina well in a container. And that thing on the left there is the base of a ficus, and there are many species of ficus, but some of them are very common houseplants. Ficus as a genus is a chasmophyte, and some consider it a geophyte. So they don't really need a lot of soil, and they do well in root-bound situations. They create a lot of what's called adventitious roots, which are roots that are not created in the soil but come out of the stem at the base of the plant, and they're also mostly tropical too. Here's a lithophyte, but it's also an epiphyte. This is a orchid that's growing on straight rock. Obviously, that's a tropical plant. There's a geophyte, that Caudex there. I think that looks like a Phakia, which is in the Asclepiad. It's a Apocynaceae, but related to Asclepius, but it's from Africa. That orchid obviously is an epiphyte, and then of course cacti and succulents. So these are all just plants that do well in containers.
Is Bursera microphylla
yes,
chasmophyte?
It is. Bursera microphylla and all elephant trees they grow well in those situations. They do well in containers, they're somewhat of a chasmophyte. Now, they don't mind if you actually pop them in a big container, they will take advantage of not all these plants that can grow like this need it. Just because it is a chasmophyte or is a geophyte doesn't mean it has to grow that way. Some of these plants, if you give them some root space, will just grow faster.
Does it need minerals or feeding in container? And then what about?
Okay, so and we're going to get into all plants need feeding, even cacti. They don't, cacti and succulents and geophytes, they don't need to be fed as often. But if you want them to look good, and you want them to look a little better than they would normally look in nature, in nature, in these arid, tough environments, these plants will grow, but they don't always look beautiful. So, we do baby them a little bit to make them look a little better. And as long as you got the light right and all that, and your watering is your timing's good on these succulents, um, then yeah, some feeding is fine. And by the way, if you get into cacti and succulents, and we have a class coming up on growing weird plants and growing fun, crazy, weird cacti and succulents. It's a lifetime pursuit, so don't feel bad if you don't know about every single type of cacti and succulent, because it's mind-boggling how much there is out there. And getting to know how to grow these things is getting to know where these plants are from, when did the rainfall happen where they are native, what kind of soil they're growing on. That's something that you're always learning. So if you get freaky about plants and you're growing cacti and succulents, you're going to become a nature nerd, because you have to. You have to learn how to grow them, or you're just going to kill plants, But yeah. Anyway, so let's move on. Potting soil. Now, potting soil is the medium in which you grow things, right? It's not going to be. You're not going to treat the soil in a container the same as you would treat the ground. And what I mean by that, often people are like, "Well, I got a big pot. Do I just like dig up some dirt and put it in there, or do I just buy compost?" You always have these questions. The short answer is you need potting soil if you're going to grow in a container. But that's just a short answer. Your potting soil is not always going to be the same for everything. In general, if you get just regular old-fashioned potting soil, it's going to be good for most things that are not cacti and succulents or orchids or something that's specialized. If you're growing vegetables, if you're growing houseplants, if you're growing, well, actually some houseplants require very good drainage and all that, and you might want to lean towards a cactus mix. But here's two examples here, and I put tanks, potting soils here because I really am big on supporting small and local companies over these. Don't go to Home Depot if you can help it. Because I don't know. It's really good to support local business. But anyway, so obviously you can see on the left there. Their regular potting mix there is a little tighter, and that's going to be more for like vegetables and herbs or a shrub or something you're trying to grow. On the right is a cactus mix, which they're using a lot of coconut coir, by the way, and it's much more well drained and allows a lot more oxygen. That's what a lot of cacti and succulents like, and even some of these tropical plants that. Let's put it this way: a lot of house plants that do well in houses are one of two things. It's either a plant that takes a long time to die, or it's a tropical plant that has the ability to tolerate some very tough conditions. And when I say tropical, is deep in the tropics, in the bottom of the tropical forest, it's really dark, and so that's why a lot of our houseplants are tropical. They can tolerate that low light. You always want to give them as much light as possible. We'll talk about houseplants later, but if you get into making your own potting soil, it's going to be, you got to experiment and do some research. It depends on what you're growing, obviously, but here's just a little bit of an overview of some of the substances you might use in making your own potting soil. In this picture we have on the left is pumice. Sometimes it's not as colorful as that pumice, but sometimes it's just pearly white. That's perlite actually, and perlite is a synthetic pumice. But pumice is airy, full of holes. It's very light. It creates a lot of air and drainage. That's its purpose. On the top right there is coconut coir. It's so this is somewhat of a new product. We used to use peat moss more than coconut coir, but coconut coir is sort of taking over because it's a waste product and it's cheaper. When it first came out, it was super salty, but the people who create that stuff have figured out how to they figured out how to make it less salty. And so, yes, pumice is volcanic, by the way.
Oh, sorry.
Or you saw. Pumice is volcanic. It comes out of a volcano. Most of the stuff you see, if it's not synthetic, it comes out of the ground. But a lot of that volcanic stuff is on the surface. After a volcanic, where there's pumice, there's so much of it. But yes, it's volcanic. So yeah, the coconut core comes from the husk of a coconut. In the coconut industry, for years they had all this waste. It was like a big problem, and then they started making uses for it. It was actually one of our biggest green things that we started doing, back in the 90s. I think it might have even started as early as the 80s, but I remember in the 90s it is really when it started happening, and that's when it used to be super salty because coconuts grow on the ocean side, and there was a lot of salt in the area. So they've now improved the product so it's not salty. So it is one of the main components in a lot of potting soils. Down on the bottom right is vermiculite, and I'm pretty sure it's synthetic. It's more spongy, so it does allow for oxygen in the potting soil, in the potting medium, just because of its structure. But it also absorbs water, so it can also hold water, and it also house microbes. So if you want to house some microbes, you want some little more water retention, you might use some vermiculite. I don't use a lot of vermiculite, to be honest, but it is something you can use. It's a product you can play with. There's also, I don't have a great picture here of peat moss, but there is sphagnum moss down there. This is more of an epiphytic list used to pot up orchids with. Perlite, cinders, bark, coconut husk. But I wish I had a picture of I should have put a picture of peat moss in here because that is one of the main things. But coconut coir is a better and more sustainable product than peat moss. Peat bogs are getting, there's a lot of pressure on them, so it's probably best to use the coconut coir. Anyway, these are items you might use to make an epiphytic mix. So your orchids mostly. Orchids, some of them just grow on. You can see that one on the left there. That one's just growing on a board. And there are certain orchids that just need a humid environment. And so if you have a greenhouse, you can grow them on a board like that. But if you don't have a greenhouse, it's a little hard to do that. My friend Mark Demmett, who was in the beginning of the video, that picture of him with the orchids, he has a lot of plants like this because he's got a giant, greenhouse with lots of, element control. Of course, there's sand, and this is something that you can use in a lot of different potting mixes. Of course, cacti love sand, and then there's a lot of desert plants, of course, that love sand as well. How much of organic material should you use in your mix? Again, this is going back to what are you growing? Is it a geophyte or a cactus? You're going to use a lot less organic material. But here's a good little. This will help you give you an idea of what you're really aiming at. So, really look at half of this is air and water. So half of the actual area that's taken up inside of a pot is usually air and water. That's your goal usually. Mineral particles is like the solids, and so it's the sand or the pumice or the native dirt that doesn't have a lot of organic material might be that mineral particles portion of your soil mix. So you can see as important as humus is or organic material in your pot, it's not a big presence in the soil mix, but if you don't have it, it's a big deal. Now, if you're growing cacti and succulents, that humus portion shrinks down to even lower than 4%. So yeah, just to give you an idea of what we're looking at. They put organisms at 1%. I would put it below 1%, but I think this is just to give you a visual idea of what you're looking at. So really half of that chart is your potting mix. Unless you're able to picture your potting mix with the air and the water in there. if you know what I mean. A lot of your potting mix is going to be inert stuff. It's not all organic. The organic portion is a certain amount, but it's not like a huge amount in a potting situation. Now, again, what you're growing will determine like how much of all this you have in there, because if it's an epiphyte, it needs a lot more air. If it's a cactus, it needs a lot less of that humus in there. But what are the roles? Like, what do you, when you're creating, these soil mixes, like, what are the roles of all the components? I guess I'm kind of already said that, but I'm just going to kind of go over it again. The organic portion of your potting mix is the part of the mix that's going to feed your plant. And so it's a small portion, but it's one of the most important portions of your mix. Some people I've seen pot up their cactus in almost, and not almost, but entirely inert ingredients. And they will grow in that. Cacti and succulents and even a lot of the geophytes will grow in like all inert ingredients with no organic material. But they might not necessarily thrive unless you're always feeding water-soluble fertilizers. I don't really grow that way. So I like having biology in my mix, so I do add some organics even in my cactus mix. But the organic portion of the food is the sphagnum moss and whatever food you're using, or coconut coir. Those are the parts of the soil that are going to mostly host those microbes. Although microbes are living inside the pumice too, and they're living around that grit, but they get pushed out of that a lot easier in the grit. But they can't, actually pumice is a nice thing to have in soil because all those little holes, a lot of microbes can dwell in there. Some of your soil components are there to retain water and transport nutrients. Peat moss has been so popular as a potting mix over the eons because its nature is such that it's stringy, and so it has like these channels where microbes can get to plants. It's always been a great medium, and the coconut coir is now the substitute for that. And again, making oxygen and supporting microbes. Now, seasons are something to take into consideration. We've only touched upon this so far, but the biggest thing is winter. Especially you in Colorado, if you're growing anything that's somewhat frost tender, obviously you're going to have to deal with winter. And we have a lot of this here. Tucson gets fairly cold. We get below freezing and sometimes down into the 20s. And so we have to protect our plants. And, you can cover them. If a plant goes dormant, and a lot of these cool caudiciforms and cacti and succulents are dormant in the wintertime. There's a lot of exceptions to that rule, but most of them are winter dormant. And what does that mean? It means you could take them into the house, because if they're dormant, they're not growing. If they're not growing, they're not using light as much, and so they're not going to etiolate. And what do I mean by etiolate? Etiolate is when a plant stretches for the sun. It's very obvious on cactus, because cactus get that little that little dunce hat looking thing. That's just the plant doesn't have enough energy to create thick stems, and it looks like it's reaching for the sun. So that's what happens when a plant is actively growing and not getting enough light. But if it's dormant, it's not growing, especially if it doesn't have leaves on it. And so you can take them inside and, still put them in the bright part of your house if you can, but they're not really growing, so you don't have to worry about them. And I had back in the 90s, I had a girlfriend who left me because I had too many plants. And one of the things I think was the last straw was in the wintertime, when I had a bunch of bursaras. Someone brought up bursaras. And they go dormant in the wintertime, and I didn't have enough greenhouse space, so my whole living room was full of bursaras. And these are big bursaras. They had trunks like, I had one that had almost a foot trunk on it. And, they were too tall for one of the greenhouses. And she left.
What was the word for stretching towards light?
Etiolate.
How do you etiolate?
E-T.
Oh.
Ulate. U-L-A-T. E-T-I. It's Ulate.
Oh, god damn it.
Sorry. So seasons. The other thing to remember. Okay, so winter. Like if things are going dormant, you can take them inside. You have a lot more.
Got it. Never mind.
I spelled it a little bit. Idiolate is spelled E-T-I-O-L-A-T-E. Idiolate. Stretch for the stretch. For, that's when they stretch because they're not getting enough light. Anyway, another seasonal thing to pay attention to is spring. If you have especially herbs and vegetables that you're growing in pots, the spring hits quicker than we're ever ready for. Because, in the wintertime, you get very comfortable with like, I don't have to water that often. And then it starts to warm up and it feels balmy outside and you're like, oh, it's so nice out. I love this so much. And you're outside and you're like, maybe you go hiking and stuff. And then you come home one day and it's like everything's wilting. And it's because it's a combination. In spring, you get not only the warmer temperatures, but it gets windy out. So things dry out a lot quicker. You got to pay attention to that, particularly in containers, because you don't. The thing that containers do not give you is leeway. In the ground, you have some leeway, but in the containers, they dry out so fast and everything changes so fast. They're just less forgiving. So when the spring comes and it starts to warm up, start thinking about that and watch your plants a little closer because they're going to dry out quicker. The other thing to think about seasonally is when to transplant. In general, you don't transplant a plant just any time, especially if a plant is more on the succulent side. Plants that are succulent tend to rot if they're transplanted when they're dormant. And not all plants are obviously dormant, right? So like a bursera, when it goes dormant, is I need a drink. A bursera, when it goes dormant, drops its leaves. It's obvious, right? But there are a lot of plants that are evergreen or don't have leaves also go dormant, but they may not look dormant. And so they slow down and they're not growing as much and they're not actively growing new roots. And if you take a plant like that and you pot it up into a bigger pot and give it all this like empty root space, you are likely to get rot, particularly with cacti. When cactus go dormant in the winter, they're not obviously dormant. And this is where you need to sort of learn about where the cactus is from that you're growing. Now, if you don't know and you don't feel like asking, you can almost assume that it's a summer grower because most cactus are. But there's a lot of cactus that are native to Baja California or just parts of the New. By the way, most cacti, I think, all cacti are native to the New World. But the cactus have eked out into other parts of the world because they've been introduced, but they're all native here. But there are a lot of areas in the New World that get all their rainfall in the wintertime. Baja California is a good example, or coastal California. So those plants, their active growing season is in the wintertime, and in the summertime they dry out. And that's true about not just cacti and succulents, but like even if you've ever grown a Cleveland sage, it's a pretty easy plant to grow. But you might notice that in the early summer in June, July, they kind of look, they look kind of rough. There's nothing wrong with them. They're just dormant. And they sleep a little bit because where they're from, Southern California, they don't get a lot of summer rain. And so they, they're just in that habit of, they have the memory in their genes of where they're from, and they go dormant. Anyway, when you're transplanting a plant, you want to transplant a plant when it's actively growing, and depending on the plant, like succulents, you don't want to give them a lot more room than they were already in, for the most part. There's always exceptions, but but with succulents, you want to be careful about how much space you give them. With other plants, you can go hog wild, and sometimes with cacti and succulents, you can go hog wild too. Like adeniums, adeniums are summer growers, and so in the summertime, right when it first starts to heat up, you could take a 1 gallon adenium and pot it up into a 5, and by the end of the summer, that plant's gonna be growing so much bigger than it was before. Now it doesn't need that; it can grow in a small pot and stay root bound, and it's just fine because it's a geophyte. But those of us who've been growing plants for a long time have learned which plants we can push, and adenium's one of them. You can water them like a tomato in the summer. But you water them like that in the wintertime, and it'll rot. In fact, some adeniums, they even get a hint of water in the wintertime, and then they just rot. So it's all about getting to know your plants and where they're from. There's, let's see, what was I intending with this picture? I think in the left there, that looks like an uzu, and there's something you can push into a bigger pot. It's also something you can that might need to. Oh no, uzus are actually pretty hardy,
but
so you don't
can keep citrus trees small in a pot.
Yes.
Dwarf them.
Yeah, the nice thing about citrus, they give so much fruit that a full tree gives you way more fruit than you can ever eat. And here's this potted plant, and it's giving you quite a bit of fruit still. You can get a lot more citrus in your yard if you containerize a bunch of them, and you can still enjoy having the citrus, but it's not taking up as much space. And you can leave that citrus in there almost indefinitely, really. That mint, mint's one of these plants that you need to deal with because they jump out of the pot, right? And so you'll need to divide them every once in a while. You dig them up and you split them up and divide them. Otherwise, they're going to jump out of the pot, and then you'll have them growing all over the place. I have that picture of that's Cyphlostema jatea. Look at that weird thing. It's in the grape family. I love plants that look like this. The leaves are succulent. They're deciduous. They drop in the winter. I think I have a picture later in the slideshow of it deciduous, but that thing can probably stay in that pot indefinitely. Hanging baskets are tough in this climate. In dry climates, they're really difficult. You gotta water them all the time. And some of these succulents will do okay, but they look better as an idea than they are in reality. And there's a lot of that. Now in California, where it's arid but not as arid as here, these kinds of things work a lot better than they do here. But they can work here. They just require a lot more attention. I do like those old-fashioned sphagnum hanging baskets because you can grow things in the bottom and have them pop out. But they're just not something. Just don't get used to them. They're not going to last long. They tend to salt buildup's an issue with a lot of these things, but it's also just hot. Hanging baskets are just really tough in this climate. You can start playing with containers. Some are better ideas than others, but again, just keep playing with those same rules. The bigger and the better. The bigger, the better. And also in this climate, cloth is not a good. We had a friend of ours grow some plants, and they use these cloth containers, and we really were into this idea when we first heard about it because don't we all want to get away from plastic? But the cloth containers are horrible for plants in this climate, especially in the nursery situation. They just don't work, and plants just die in those things. And there's a picture that I have later of some cloth plants growing in cloth, but anyway, you can get really creative with old sinks, and toilets are great. I love growing plants in toilets. They're ceramic and they obviously have drainage and everything, so they're fun to grow plants in, and who doesn't love a good toilet? Here's some cloth examples. So now I put this in here because it's just an example of like ideas that work really well in other climates, but they just don't work that well here. You'll see people growing potatoes in sacks like this. And potatoes might actually work okay if you're really watering the heck out of them, but I would just stick with the ground or a regular container. Um, it's just too hot and dry. That bottom right hand corner, by the way, I think is galangal. You know what galangal is? It's related to ginger. That's a great plant to grow in a container.
Any of those gingers. Um, are there instances when using filtered water is warranted?
So Tucson, someone asked if filtered water is ever warranted. Well, number one, it's kind of expensive, right? Because you usually have to pay for it unless you have a filter. Um, water is an issue here in Tucson because ever since we got the CAP water, it's been very rough on us because our water's full of junk. There are times where I use we have drinking water in our house. We go and fill up our 5 gallon jugs full of distilled water. Now we add if you use distilled water, you're going to want to add some nutrients to it because it'll have the opposite effect. It'll pull nutrients away from plants because it's distilled, it's empty. So it'll pull the ions away from the plants. So you want to add some food into distilled water if you use it. It just seems like an expensive way to water plants. But if you have some plants that you really care about, you really want to get them away. If they're salt sensitive or something, you might use distilled water and then add nutrients to it. So you just have to be very careful. And then here's growing food, of course, in containers is what a lot of people are trying to do too, because a lot of people don't have a yard really. They don't have like arable, or maybe there's poison in the soil too, or something. It's always something. Maybe somebody poured, something terrible into the soil, like they turn their thing into a driveway, and then the soil underneath there is just awful, and you can't grow anything in it. That's not uncommon. Then you want to go up, right? So you got to be creative. Again, same rules. Large containers. Some of them work better than others. These vertical gardens that are all the rage right now, I love the idea of vertical gardens, but this is tough to do in our climate because it's hot. And so, like, these are pictures from California, probably. It's not that you can't do this here. It's just going to require a lot more water, and your seasons are not going to be as long. Like, if you're growing lettuces and stuff like that, they're going to bolt sooner in a container. Bolting means go to flower. You'll see lots of great ideas on the internet. You just always be careful about the ideas you get on the internet because they're everywhere else, right? They're not always here. Anytime you're looking up information about plants, try to look up information that's place based, because where you live has an effect on everything. And in our region of the world, which I assume everyone who's watching is at least in the Southwest, it's drier, and so a lot of these ideas that work in moister climates do not work well here. A lot of people grow plants in containers. If they're growing food in containers, they do it because they have a thing for tropical fruits. And so, we have some of these in our yard. There's a lychee in there, and there's bananas. You're never going to grow enough to really feed yourself a lot. You're doing this because you're interested in where your food comes from, and you may want to just have a little more connection with what you eat. Even if you don't always, eat your bananas off your plant and you buy them, you at least know what the plant looks like. And you have an idea of seasonality and all that. But this is another reason people grow things in plants. And again, bigger the
pots.
What did I say?
Plants.
Grow things in plants. Grow things in pots. Yeah.
Do you think that there's a leaching concern when veggies are grown in plastic containers?
Oh, you mean leaching is in term?
from
If you
the
mean,
plastic?
yeah. So the there is, but here's the thing: plastics are everywhere now. There's nothing you can do about it. We know that we have intimate um, um, experience with this subject, but the number one cause of cancer right now is plastics and pesticides, and they are everywhere. And so, anytime you can get away from plastic, try to. If you can get a big concrete pot instead of a plastic pot, do what you can. It's really hard, as much as we're anti-plastic, we can't get away from it. Um, Plastics do get into the water supply. Now, do they get into your food if you're growing food? Not so much, But my message to you regarding that subject is plasticides, or I think they call it plasticides, but microplastics are everywhere, and they're already in your drinking water. They're everywhere, and it's now life is all about prevention. So we drink a lot of green tea, and do lots of things that are anti-cancers because there's so many carcinogens in our world now, and they're only increasing. That the best way around all that is to be preventative about it. You can't really stop it now. We are trying very hard to get away from plastic in our lives, and we're always looking for new options. So it's just really hard to get away from. But here's one thing I don't want people to do if you're trying to grow food. What's wrong with this picture? This is the most common thing you see if you Google growing herbs for your kitchen. You'll see these tiny little planters, and you'll see these plants in here. What's wrong with this? If you know anything about any of these plants, you know that all these plants grow so much bigger than this pot can ever accommodate. So at best, you've bought yourself like a month, and then you're gonna have to yank one of those plants out of there and put them in another pot. So this idea of trying to grow plants in a cute little windowsill with a cute little pot, especially in Arizona, yeah, overcrowding is a problem. It's not going to work, and this doesn't even work in other places too. It makes a great Instagram picture, but there's a lot of things that make great Instagram pictures that have nothing to do with reality, and this is one of them. So this is more what you want to do. This is a little more correct on how to grow things. There's some time there in that bottom right, and it's been given room to spread out and grow. And those pots up on the right, top right there. Every plant has its own little pot where it can expand and grow, and then you can pick it but it has room to grow, and you can move them around and make sure they get the right light. But stuffing a bunch of plants in a tiny little pot is not the way to go. You really want to give everything enough room to grow. So know how big a plant gets. That's a really important thing. And what is this over and over again that we're learning throughout this whole class is just really getting to know the plant. Like, don't treat plants like furniture. They're living things. They change and they grow. They have seasons. And so just know what they're going to do, and that'll help you accommodate that. More on growing food in containers. A lot of our food comes on vines, like various squashes, and this is bitter melon, which we're a big fan of because it's anti-carcinogenic, very anti-cancerous. And if you're into food and you love different flavors too, I mean, this is not a crowd pleaser because bitter melon lives up to its name. It's really bitter. It tastes like you're eating green things, like we're literally eating green plants that are not necessarily the kinds that we're used to eating. But if you know how to cook it, it's delicious, and I love the flavor of bitter melon. I love the bitterness of it. But anyway, this is a vine, so obviously if you grow this in a container, plan for where it's going to go. If it's going to vine all over the place, you got to give it somewhere to go. And this is something that sounds like really elementary things to say, but I'm presenting stuff to you that I see happen every day when people plant things. They don't necessarily plan for what it's going to do. and what it's going to look like. They plant for what it looks like at the moment. So you always got to keep in mind and know how big it's going to get. And cacti and succulents we've talked a lot about throughout this, but this is the cactus part of the section, and I've covered a lot of it really, but this is a whole fun world to get into. Like, cacti and succulents are really fun, and I can't stress enough that these are great container plants for our climate because they are equipped to live in hot climates. They're appropriate for our patios. You can take them inside when they're dormant and protect them from the frost. A lot of them are frost tender, but man, can you grow some cool, weird plants, And if you can get into weird, man, it's endless. It literally is endless. I've been doing this. I'm turning 48 this year, and I've been obsessed with plants my entire life. I still meet new weird plants all the time. And it's fun. It's something that I'll never get tired of, and so when it comes to container growing, like, this is one of the main reasons that I've grown plants in containers for so long, because some of these plants that don't actually do that well in the ground, particularly because they're frost tender, so they're really fun to grow. Here's that grape relative again, and there's the caudex that's peeling back. The picture's kind of cut off in this, but there's no leaf on the top of that because that's the dormant version of it on the right-hand side. But on the left is a plant with its leaves. I put this in here, but I've already talked about it. But this picture is to illustrate, to know about the plant and where it's from. This is a mammillaria. Mammillarias are very sensitive to overwatering if they're watered during a season that they're not native to. So, and cacti in general are like that. So, like, especially a lot of mammillarias, like if they're a summer grower and they don't normally get water in the winter time, you're going to almost never water them. Now, you won't totally not water them in the entire winter. If it hasn't rained at all and it hasn't gotten any precipitation, you may give it a little water in the wintertime. You don't want it to completely dry out. Again, this depends on how big your container is too. But again, it's just learning about those seasons. And some of our succulents are a little more work. Even though they're succulents and from dry climates, there's things you have to know about them and when to water them and when to pot them up. So lithops are really cute. These look like little butts. A little fanny, and they're cool. They're from Africa. They're called living stones. In nature, they actually grow almost flush in the ground. We tend to raise them up a little bit in cultivation, but they're really tough to grow. These are not are for beginners necessarily. They you have to really know. If you ever buy these, and there's actually a nursery that specializes. It's called Living Stones Nursery or Plants of the Southwest. They're over on Blackledge and Stone area. One of the coolest nurseries in Tucson, and they grow a lot of other things besides this, but mostly cacti and succulents. But they have more lithops than probably anyone in the world, or at least anyone that's not in Africa. And anyway, if you look down on the bottom panel there, what these things do is when the new leaves come on, those are leaves. It's like two leaves, and they're next to each other. And when the new leaves come on, they come out of the middle of the plant, and those old leaves dry up, and then they get pushed to the outside. And the thing you need to know about this plant, this is a little more than just knowing its season and when the rains come. This plant, when it's going through this process of pushing those old leaves out and the new leaves are coming in, that plant's actually using the resources of the old leaves, which help dry up those outer leaves and allow it to come out of the middle. Now, if you were to water it during this period, what happens is that outer side swells, and then it kind of crams that little plant in the middle, and it has a hard time getting out. So here's a little thing you just need to know about this plant, that'll help you understand how to grow it. when it's going through this process, you're probably not water it, and let it do its thing until it busts out of the old leaves, and then it's able to grow, and then you can water it. So anyway, and then and lastly, house plants. There are no plants that are native, right? So house plants have a very hard time we kill more house plants probably than anything else in this country, because again, people are treating them like furniture. I love how popular houseplants are becoming right now because of Instagram. Sometimes I get a little sick of the white wall with the monstera. Like, it's how many pictures do you need to see of that? But but uh, but where I'm getting at with that is that just remember these are living things and they need things, and particularly they need light. And so if you can get some light on these things, it depends on how freaky you are about plants, right? If you're like us, you don't mind that lighting system on the right-hand side is very intense. It's a full spectrum light, and it's really a weird thing to have in your house. People who are really into plants don't mind it. Usually I turn something like this on at night, not in a room that you sleep in maybe, but where that weird, crazy reddish light is not going to, be weird. And then the plant during the day, it can just you can have it off. But the grow lights that are full spectrum like that, where you can really grow some things inside, are pretty intense. People who grow pot know these lights because they're growing pot for a very specific reason in a very specific way. But a light like that's on that monstera right there is sufficient for especially those kinds of plants which are tropical. Now, like I said, our house plants are tropical, and that's because tropical forests are very dark. They have a giant canopy overhead, and plants are all competing for light. So the plants in tropical areas are very tough. The only thing they're not tough about is the frost or cold weather, but they're very tough at dealing with dryish and dark conditions. So now, does that mean you put a plant in the dark part of your house? Light is always the biggest failure that people have. Most house plants, this is a gross generalization, but it's just a starting point. And again, you got to get to know all the plants you're growing. But most of your non-succulent plants get watered about once a week, and then you want to let them dry out a little bit, not bone dry, but you want to let them dry out a little bit in between waterings. Always make sure there's drainage. A lot of people will take their plants to their sinks and showers or bathtubs to water them, and so that they can water them thoroughly and let them drain out, and then put them back in. Because obviously you can't just take a hose around your house and water. I haven't done that yet, actually. I haven't watered a plant in my house with a hose. Yeah. Surprisingly, maybe someday I'll build a house where we can allow that. We'll have concrete floors and drains. Yeah, that's what we should do in our next house. Wouldn't that be cool?
Yeah.
All right, so some of you may have questions. I want to open up this part of the presentation to questions, or maybe I answered a bunch of questions for you. It's a big subject, and people are, like I said, some of you are growing cacti and succulents, some of you are growing vegetables in raised containers, and so I know it's hard to cover everything, but we are talking about generally growing too. It's just generally growing in a specialized situation, and containers are specialized. It's a difficult place to grow things. So if you have any questions, let us know.
I have one.
Okay.
Do you know what soil combo is good in a really large container for old-fashioned traditional iris with rhizomes, not bulbs?
Okay. So irises are geophytes. So they like really good drainage, but they're also feeders. They love food, particularly phosphorus, because they're bloomers. So I would put them. I mean, irises are actually pretty tolerant of a lot of situations. Have you ever seen around town? I've seen a lot of old iris plants that have been abused. Some somebody planted them like 20 years ago in some backyard and haven't been watered, and so they can tolerate a lot of conditions. But if you really want them to thrive, give them a good, well-drained mix, and but you might not want to use necessarily a cactus mix on irises. I would probably do like a regular potting soil, but add a little bit more pumice, and just feed them fairly often. Hold on, I'm gonna do this really quick here. Okay, there we go. So yeah, feeding more, especially phosphorus, is the big thing. Phosphorus is the middle number on your fertilizers, and irises are grown for their blooms. So what you're trying to accomplish is flowers. And if they don't have enough phosphorus, they're not going to flower very well. And just know their seasons. They go dormant and all that. I'm trying to remember. Usually irises, you obtain those rhizomes in the fall. That's usually when they're available, and then you plant them, and they grow throughout the cool season, and they bloom in the spring. And then they sort of go dormant in the summertime. I think it's been a while since I've grown irises, but that's what I remember. And they don't go totally dormant. They don't, like, some bulbs entirely die at the top, but irises will stay green at the top. They'll just kind of look rough, in the summertime. So.
Do bulbs like crocus and daffodils grow in Tucson?
Yes. Daffodils are very easy to grow. Crocuses you can grow, and crocuses need to be refrigerated. The three bulbs that you need to refrigerate are crocus, hyacinth, yes, and tulips. And there's probably some specialized ones that I'm not thinking of right now, but the crocuses, hyacinth, and tulips need to be refrigerated before you plant them. Daffodils are really easy to grow. They're the other ones that naturalize pretty easily and can take a lot of crap, and then like you move into a house and you didn't even know they were there, and you're like, water gets into one part of the yard and they pop it. You're like, what's that? So daffodils are pretty easy to grow. Again, they do way better if you feed them. And so, make sure you're feeding your bulbs. But yeah, bulbs in general, they're geophytes. So they grow in rocky conditions. They grow well in containers. And so, so you can grow them here and grow them in containers. Any other questions?
Oops. I think that's it.
Katie was also answering questions like.
Tick tick.
Okay. Can you think of anything I haven't covered? Our lives are container growing. That's what we do for a living. What's that say?
She was asking about harvesting water from the shower in the kitchen for edible foods versus ornamentals.
And you're asking. So you're talking about gray water, and gray water can be used. Gray water is always more intense because it's salty and it has junk in it. Your soap, and I see that you use Dr. Bonner's, which is better than most soaps. And it all depends on how much of that you use, and if it's the only source of water, that might be a little heavy for the plants, a little heavy on the salts and stuff. But soap has phosphorus in it actually, so soap is.
And with edible foods, you definitely want to.
Yeah, you want
just clean water.
Yeah, with edible foods especially. But you can use it. Just feel it out. You got to feel it out. It all depends on the soil that you're dealing with and the plants that you're growing, and how much soap you're using and all that, really in relation to how much you're rinsing. But you're gonna have to feel that out. But if you see some burning on the edges of the leaves, if you've been started using that water and you see like that burning on the edges of the leaves, that's salt buildup. And so salt damage is very obvious on plants because especially this time of year when it's really hot, when plants draw the water up from the ground, the way plants cool themselves off is they pull water out and they evaporate it off their leaves. Evaporation, like swamp cooling, is evaporative cooling. When water evaporates, it cools, and so that's what plants use to cool themselves off. If there's salt, a lot of salt in your water, the salt doesn't evaporate, obviously, and so if there's a lot of salts in in the water, the plant can't deal with it all, and so it accumulates on the edges of the leaves where the water is evaporating.
For gray water in containers, drainage is key.
Yeah, drainage is definitely key, and so is flushing those containers with regular water once in a while. So yeah, that's true if you're really into feeding your plants. I've known people. We have some customers who are really into experimenting. They love to like use different fertilizers and all that. And I've known a few people who've caused some damage to their plants by fertilizing a little too much. So anytime you gotta give, feeding is the thing that people don't do most of the time. So I'm not going to ever discourage feeding, but overfeeding is an issue too. And so you want some regular water in there once in a while too.
Somebody asked how to grow vine vegetables like zucchinis, squash, etc.
Again, big container. That's especially important for vining vegetables. The bigger the container, the better. And then you just need to give it something physical to climb on. Most of those plants have little tendrils and stuff, and they have little appendages that'll wrap around some kind of whatever's around to wrap around, and it might be another plant, So like if you're growing squash next to your other plants, you got to really manage them to make sure that they don't grow into each other. That's one of our big challenges at the nursery. We're always trying to deal with having a lot of plants in a little bit of space, and vining things are a lot of work. So give the plants something to climb on. I'm a big fan of it's cheap and it disappears, but hardware cloth, which is not cloth at all. It looks like chicken wire, but it's a lot thicker. They use it to make sidewalks and stuff. But it's the metal square meshy like stuff, and those are the technical terms for it. The meshy type stuff. Anyway, they'll know what you're talking about at Home Depot.
Hardware cloth.
It's called hard. I said that in the beginning.
Yeah, I'm just making sure.
Oh yeah, hardware cloth. And go to Ace Hardware, by the way, because did you know that Ace Hardwares are all locally owned? That's good. And they usually have that stuff. So go there. But anyway, hardware cloth is a great thing. And once the vines are on it, you don't even see the hardware cloth anymore. And don't worry about it being metal. As long as it's not beating on a south wall, you don't want to have a squash plant on a south wall anyway. Containers, be careful about those really hot spots in the summertime, because a south-facing wall is cooking all day long, and it's hotter than just being in full sun. It's like a microwave. It's not just getting beaten down by the initial contact of the sun, but the sun bounces off the wall and hits it from the other side. Reflected heat's really hard on a lot of plants. So there are some plants that take it just fine, like orchid vine will grow in that and be just happy. Orchid vine's a native plant, native-ish. It's from Baja, California. It'll grow in reflected heat on metal mesh and not even drop a leaf. But squash, I would give it a little bit of a break. Don't grow it in reflected heat.
If someone has a carbon filter that prevents salt buildup but maybe edits minerals.
Yeah, a carbon filter is better than... Yeah, again, when you add your food, obviously, you would add some food afterward. But a carbon filter is going to take out some of those damaging salts that are in our CAP water. And so, yeah, that's fine. And then... just remember to remember, you're also pulling the nutrients out in a carbon filter too. So every once in a while, you want to feed. So it depends on how you're feeding. If you're using like the low grade synthetic, like we showed that VH11 that I showed you in the beginning, or some low grade fertilizer like that, um, then you can feed with that almost every time you water. Or if you're using an organic fertilizer, you don't have to do that every time. But just know that that you're pulling nutrients out if you use a carbon filter.
That's all I have. Yeah.
All right. Uh, everyone doing okay with the weather?
I wonder if you could line a pot with cloth.
Oh, there was something I want to mention. That's very common to do in potting situations where people put gravel in the bottom of the pot. It's like something that a lot of people do. The only thing, it does not improve drainage. I'm going to start off by saying that. People think that they're improving drainage if they have a pot and they put a bunch of gravel in the bottom and then they put potting soil. The only thing that does is shorten your pot. So don't do that. Some people will put a little layer in there to block some of the soil from washing out, but I don't know if that actually works. You do, and you will have some soil wash out of your pot. It all depends on how the drainage holes are. Some pots lose soil quicker than others. And don't think of pots as ever being a permanent situation. You're always going to want to transplant, even if you're not trying to go into a bigger pot and you have a cactus that you're growing in a pot and it's not really ever going to outgrow that pot it's in. Every once in a while, you're still going to take it out of that pot once in a while and kind of refresh the soil, because the organic material leaves after a while, and you're always going to want to replace it. And but also like salt buildup and all those other things that you're going to want to manage when you pull a plant out. You don't have to do that often with plants like a cactus, but every once in a while you will need to do that. But yeah, you don't need to put gravel in the bottom of a pot. It just shortens your pot, and that's not something you really want in this climate. They do it everywhere. I've seen so many videos on YouTube and on just on the internet where people like put a layer of gravel, and then you don't need to do that. It's extraneous, and it just shortens your pot.
She was asking lining a pot with cloth so that as a means of transplanting later on, thinking more for decorative pots.
So if you mean cloth on the outside of the root ball and you kind of slip it into a pot, I don't see any issues with that. Lucy is very vocal. That's Lucy and Ethel are Chihuahuas. So if you have cloth on the outside of the root ball, I don't see too many issues with that, and that would actually keep you from losing too much soil, but it might keep that root ball a little wetter, which is not a bad thing for a lot of plants. But just manage your watering. Just make sure that it's not too much, like you're not losing any drainage.
Would the plant root into the cloth?
It will root into the plant will root into that cloth. And depending on how long it's in that situation, it may make that cloth a permanent part of its root ball. That's not necessarily a bad thing, especially if it's cotton. Eventually that cotton will decompose anyway. So if it's something that's going to be in that situation for a long time, the cotton will eventually decompose. But if it's a temporary situation, then you'll just need to pull that. There'll be some rooting into that cloth, and so you'll need to pull that apart.
I think that's all. Oh, you was. I think that's all we have. Sorry. Yeah.
All right.
All the questions.
It looks like that's all your questions. Thank you for taking the class with us. I hope you got a lot out of it. You can always, if you're watching this later on an archived situation, you can always message us, or if you think of something later and you're watching this now, you can always message us with questions. And um, you might wake up in midnight and be like, "What was I? Oh, I forgot. I was thinking about this thing," and then you can ask a question. I won't answer it at midnight, but we'll get to it. Thanks for checking in with us, and try to stay cool. And fall's coming, hopefully. Plant some trees. Maybe if we plant some more trees, it won't be so